Hi, I'm Andrew Yang. You may remember me as being the guy who wanted to get money into the hands of millions of Americans. Well, I'm still at it, and I'm now the founder of Noble Mobile, the first carrier that pays you to use your phone less. With Noble, you get unlimited talk, text, and 5G data on the T-Mobile network, and you can earn up to $20 cash back a month for getting off your phone. Try it for just $10 a month. Go to noblemobile.com/yang10. That's noblemobile.com and use my code YANG10 to get paid to use your phone less.
This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Love this podcast? Support this show through the Acast supporter feature. It's up to you how much you give, and there's no regular commitment. Just hit the link in the show description to support now.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states or situations.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. At Mint Mobile, we like to do the opposite of what Big Wireless does. They charge you a lot. We charge you a little. So naturally, when they announced they'd be raising their prices due to inflation, we decided to deflate our prices due to not hating you. That's right. We're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
Cue the fireplace and your favorite fall movie. There's nothing better than a cozy evening at home with a glass of First Leaf wine. First Leaf is a personalized wine club that delivers right to your door. Sounds magical, right? They get to know your favorite tasting notes, which varietals you enjoy, and whether you prefer sweet or dry wines. So in every shipment, you get bottles tailored to your unique palate. Go to tryfirstleaf.com/fall to get your first 6 wines for just $44.95 with free shipping.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I'm a writer and film critic, and today I'm delighted to be talking to Jie Li, the author of Cinematic Guerillas Propaganda, Projectionists, and Audiences in Socialist China. Thank you so much for joining me, Jie.
Thank you so much for having me.
Can you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I teach Chinese cultural studies and media studies at Harvard. I also teach a large class on East Asian cinema. This is the first time I've completed a monograph, a book on Chinese cinema, and specifically it's about projectionists and audiences, so not so much the films themselves.
And the book it's won a prize?
The book won the Kraszna-Krausz Moving Image Book Prize. I was actually very honored just to be nominated to make it to the long list. I was absolutely surprised that it actually won. So, and I'm also grateful because I get to go to London at the end of November for 2 events in association with the prize. So there'll be actually a screening also about a screening of Zhang Yimou's 1 Second. It's a film at Barbican about projections and about movie going in the 1970s China. And then I'll be giving a book talk in London as well.
I was thinking about that film all the way through reading your book. That was the film that was constantly coming back to me, which is kind of like the artistic depiction of what you're describing in the book, or at least a section of what you're describing in the book.
That's right. Yeah, I think that many Chinese directors, including Zhang Yimou, are very nostalgic for the times that they were going to cinema as children. And so there's a lot of actually like meta cinema or films about film in recent years.
Yeah, you mentioned Zhe Zhengke's platform as well as another. I mean, he's sort of inspired by an Indian film to make Pickpocket, and then he makes Platform, which is about a touring group, but they go and see films, and that sort of becomes a part of the narrative as well.
Yes. So yeah, in Zhe Zhengke's film platform, which I think was made in 2000, but it was depicting sort of this traveling singing dancing group between 1978-ish and the end of the 1980s. And there's a scene of them going to the cinema to watch a film from India, Awara Vagabond, and of course there's also sound coming over the loudspeakers, calling one of the audience members to leave the theater, and so the movie, so the book, my book also covers Chinese audiences' reception of these foreign films in the socialist period, so maybe broadly defined between 1950s and 1980s.
Right. Yeah, let's go back to that beginning, the 1950s then, and talk about... I love the way this book expanded our idea of cinema. You talk about how often cinema is divided into sort of directors and auteurs, and you're really much more focused on the sort of infrastructure of film, if you like, in China.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think this book came out of a certain puzzle I had. I've been teaching East Asian cinema, Chinese cinema for many years, but I almost never really teach the films that were made in the socialist period from 1950s to the 1970s, mostly because they're very propagandistic. And I had trouble understanding, in a way, why my parents' generation seemed so enchanted with films that seem a bit formulaic and didactic to us today. And so as I started speaking to my parents and their friends and sort of the generation born in the 1940s and 1950s, I realized that the enchantment doesn't actually come from the films themselves, but rather the movie-going experience. And in particular, I was struck that they would talk about going to cinema in open air, like outdoors. Really, there's not movie theaters for the most part in the countryside, and in fact, many places didn't even have electricity. So projectionists, these mobile movie teams, would be coming. They would be touring the villages and bringing power generators and projectors and setting up the screen, sometimes in the very middle of the night. And then they have to, if they want to watch the film, they have to get up in the middle of the night and go to the cinema. And so and this was very rare too. Maybe the projectionists would come only once every 2 or 3 months or so. And there's also very little to read. There's very little cultural activities in general in the countryside, especially during the Cultural Revolution decade. And so they remembered those movie-going experiences vividly, and also really took away things from the films that went beyond what we can see maybe retrospectively today. When we just watch the films.
It's interesting that the book, to me, feels like... I didn't know what you said when I read the book about you talking to the early generations, but it feels like an extension of that. You're sort of going out into the field and you're asking people, you're finding audience members, you're finding projectionists, and you're talking to them. And so there's a real sort of sociological aspect in that work.
Yeah, so I did start my studies as undergraduate in anthropology. So
Right.
I was very interested in doing ethnographies and even made some ethnographic film many years ago. And then I thought that instead of asking what cinema is to like myself as a scholar, maybe I ask them to like people really at the grassroots, people who were showing the films and watching the films, what films meant to them. Initially, I was also talking to some of my parents' friends who were themselves projectionists. My father was an artist in the whole, this whole propaganda infrastructure. And part of his job was actually to paint some like lantern slides, and then so he had friends whose job it was to show films. And so I spoke a little bit to them, and I realized they're a really interesting group of people. So to expand on this research, I actually took quite a number of research trips into different provinces and talking to. I interviewed about 60 projectionists across about 8 different provinces, and they had really diverse experiences and backgrounds. So, and I also realized that they're a really talented group of people, because some of the people were really good at calligraphy, some were also technically gifted. But and then some were really good artists, and they were good performers, because they not only had to show the films but also explain them. So if you I think especially for older generations, people who were showing films in the 50s, 60s, when cinema was still fairly new. I know by this time, maybe in Britain and in the Western world, most people were already watching TV. Cinema has already passed its golden age. But because film was really introduced for the first time to much of China in the 1950s and 60s, it was really a new medium for the audience, especially rural audiences. And sometimes they also had some trouble understanding the films that were made in Mandarin. And so there a lot of explanation was needed of both the language that was spoken in the film, but also of the film language, like flashbacks, or how did people get from one place to another. Some audiences were quite confused about just, there were these almost jokes about projectionists arriving, and then they got like a huge feast cooked for them, because the villagers assumed that they had an entire theater troupe had come with them, and they didn't understand where they all went. So stories like that, because there was a certain magic to these.
They thought the actors on the screen was somewhere behind the screen or something, and
that's right. Yes,
they should come out and enjoy the food.
Exactly. Yeah. So there were stories like that where audiences were really attracted also just to this very new medium, new technology that they hadn't encountered before. So
you mentioned something else as well in the book, where they actually sort of make sound effects and things. They have, even on the cover of the book, I think they're holding pieces of equipment that I assume are sort of make sounds. Is that right?
Oh yes. So on the book cover is a female projectionist holding a bamboo clapper, and she's also not quite in the foreground is actually a slide projector, and not so much the film. So before films were shown, often there was a slideshow. And the slideshows were locally made. So one of the tasks of some projectionists was to go into the village and find out what their local priorities might be. So for example, if there's a pest and that they have to advertise a pesticide or something, then they might actually draw some slides to prioritize that. And then in the meantime, they have to give an oral performance, sometimes introducing the films that are going to be screened, so that audiences don't get confused when they watch the films. And so that goes back to the fact that many of these projectionists were doing more than just operating the machines and showing the films, but also really interacting with the local audiences and clarifying what was not just the content of these films, but also sometimes even rallying audiences together, because in the countryside, people are living in quite scattered ways. So they're not all coming together. And when the village leader wants to give some directions about maybe like harvests or what the entire commune or the production brigade has to do, he needs like loudspeakers, and he needs to convene the villagers. And the film is a really good way to convene them. So sometimes a movie team might be invited to a village, not necessarily just to show a film, but just to bring villagers together so that there can be some form of mass mobilization or information that is disseminated at the film screening itself.
So this grew very, there's a point where I think they have about 500 projectionists, and then they, very quickly have thousands of projectionists and teams being trained and going out and working. And I think one of the projectionists goes to the Soviet Union and learns his trade and then comes back. This teams that would go out into the countryside and do this, is there a sense that they're not only propagandizing Mao's Socialist China, but also to some degree bringing China together as a nation, in the sense that that's what television had done for some countries? I'm speaking from Italy, and Italy very much came together because of football and television, because it was a very young country. Is that what's the relationship between this kind of activity and sort of national identity and cohesion?
Thank you. Yes, indeed. I think that cinema really made it possible for audiences, for the Chinese masses to imagine themselves as part of a nation, because they were really so before a lot of fictional films were shown, the first thing they would see maybe like slideshows, but also newsreels that show the entire country, like urban areas may have more industrialization, and then also just developments, modernization in different places. Initially, they were also kind of watching some Soviet films. Actually, like a lot of the early 1950s films that were shown in China came from the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union was technologically more advanced. And so if they saw like communal farms with tractors, that's also a way for them to envision the future of China. So kind of, it was very future looking in some ways, imagining what China could become, sometimes with Soviet Union as an example, but also urban areas, model villages, model cities, model places that become objects of aspiration. So, and then also hearing the national language is spoken, and then the cinema really did have a major role to play in the sort of the nation building process. And this happened gradually over time, because initially, when the communists first took over China in 1949, there were about like fewer than 600 movie theaters. And then in 1950 already, there was a training session for 1,800 projectionists in Nanjing who were drawn from the army, from worker unions, and from various parts of the different provinces. And all of these projectionists were learning for 3 months how to operate really machines such as projectors and power generators. And then when they returned to their provinces, they started showing films traveling quite long distances. So maybe each province initially had only just a handful of projection teams, but then they started training new projectionists over time, so that every county, by the mid 1950s, every county had at least one projection team. And this developed into about 200 projectionists per county by the late 1970s, early 1980s. So this was developing gradually over time. And in some ways, they were kind of networking that didn't have a power grid for most of it. And most of the places that projectionists went to did not have electricity, and cinema was really one of the most important media. I think the other one was actually broadcasting, radio wired broadcasting, but that's a separate project. For film, though, it was these projection teams and the films that they brought made it possible for the country to imagine like China or People's Republic of China as a nation.
I mean, you mentioned the name a couple of times, and it did pop up in my head when I was reading of the sort of Marshall McLuhan sort of the medium is the message sort of
yes.
idea. And this sort of comes to fruition later in the book when the projectionists themselves become kind of a subject of legend with three particular, is it the three sisters? The three little sisters who become a kind of almost a legendary unit of to show the adventurousness and the almost the romance of these teams going out and taking culture and taking propaganda to the provinces.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about the three sisters too. About first a little the McLuhan idea of the medium is a message. I do think for many audience members who came into contact with cinema for the first time, this was really kind of modernization, and socialism was kind of embodied by the projection team. And so the fact that cinema was there already was a very powerful form of propaganda. But taking up another idea from McLuhan when he called media extensions of man, I thought what was interesting about these projection teams is that they were extending kind of inadequate infrastructure, and because the available technology in China would not have made it possible for audiences everywhere throughout this vast land to watch films. And it was these human beings who were extending media. So humans as extensions of media rather than media as extensions of the human. So I thought that was an interesting kind of a theoretical intervention. But in terms of the Three Sisters movie team, I guess I'm very, very struck because when I tried to interview projectionists, most of them were men. And yet, when I was looking through the materials, the research materials I had, which were like magazines, but also news reports about projectionists, most of them were about women, female projectionists. And this is kind of a tough task for women to travel in, these very difficult terrain and, carrying very heavy equipment, maybe over mountains and streams. And so maybe there was also this idea of like men and women should be equal, or they should be able to perform the same kind of tasks. That was part of the agenda of the party as well, is to bring women into the labor force and into the public sphere. So there was a lot of emphasis on female projectionists, and the most famous group of projectionists who reappear again and again in the news reports and also on photography and even in the newsreel is a Three Sisters movie team from Hebei province. And so I was initially just writing based on the available materials that I had, because they were also famous for again, what's on the cover of the book right now is a slide machine. They were actually very famous for their slideshows, because it was in that area that they came from that they developed several lenses on the slide machine. So on one slide projector, there would be 3 or 4 different lenses, and then sometimes they would make these irregular format slides that you can kind of pull through and then create special effects that are almost like animation effects. So they made these very spectacular slideshows that became famous nationwide. And they were also being emulated as by other projectionists all around. And that's why like the slideshow was actually like another a parallel medium together with cinema that was very significant. I think that attributed to their fame, but also the fact that they were 3 women. But I wanted to dig a bit deeper. I really wanted to interview the original 3 sisters. They're not actually sisters to each other. They're just 3 women who were recruited into this. One was a power generator, like she was responsible for the generator itself, and another was kind of the team leader. She was organizing. She would go to every village and maybe organize the show itself. And then one was kind of a vocalist, so was also using the bamboo clapper to do various forms of oral performances. So I did try to, but by the time I went to this to their county, to their rural county, it was one had already passed away, another one could not be found anymore, and then the one person that we could get in touch with didn't really want to talk to us. So, and what I did find, yeah, but what I did find by talking to their male colleagues, that this was actually a much larger collective than just the 3 of them, because it was a major production to have these complicated slideshows painted. So none of them actually painted slideshows. What I learned is that they had a whole creative team behind them, and that they were called the red flowers above the green leaves. So the men who were helping them were called the green leaves, who were much more invisible, and they were scripting. And also, and actually the 3 women were not responsible for going into the mountains and to small villages. They were just showing films near the county seat, kind of a more I guess it's not urban, but it's not. So all the photos that we see of them were also staged. Like they were taken into those mountains, and they were asked to show a film to a village that they're normally not responsible for. So it turned out to be quite an interesting story about a group of propagandists who are themselves became propaganda, and how these propaganda images were generated in the first place. And there was a lot of infighting later on during the Cultural Revolution that I found out with the personnel and so on. So I realized that I can't actually trust the sources that I find as just historical sources. You actually need to go and talk to the people. And then I also understood why the original three sister may not have wanted to talk to me, because there's such a disjunction between the reality of what they did and how they were represented in the national media.
Let's talk a little bit about the propaganda that they were actually showing, because there was lots of different things. As you've already said, there was some sort of basic educational materials, such as how to use pesticides on crops, or various campaigns that were going on that were being sent down from the party headquarters. But there were also other things like the military, which were very popular, the sort of the jingoistics, military triumphalist sort of films as well, and films about military tactics that you mention throughout the book. What other elements of the films were actually being shown?
Yeah, the most popular kinds of films were indeed war films, and specifically guerrilla war films, because the Chinese communists came to power in part by fighting guerrilla warfare in the countryside, rather than having these very organized army units. And guerrillas are very interesting figures because they're kind of camouflage, and they're not they're sometimes indistinguishable from civilians. So there's already a lot of tension and dramatic interest to many war films that involve guerrillas. And guerrillas are also portrayed in these 50s, 60s films as being very self-sacrificial. And because they endured so many hardships, audiences who watch these films, the lesson that they learn, or the lesson that they have to profess in public, is that, because so many revolutionary martyrs and soldiers had sacrificed their lives for our country, then, it's nothing for us to give they shed blood. We are just shedding sweat. So that's no problem. So what if we have to starve a little bit and work throughout the night, because these revolutionary heroes and these soldiers had given so much. So the key lesson in some ways of many these war films is self-sacrifice and readiness to kind of mobilize for all kinds of mass campaigns as if it were a war. So, but there were many different kinds of campaigns to mobilize for. And one of the most interesting, I thought, was actually coming back to the pests, but there was actually a nationwide Eliminate the Four Pests campaign in 1958.
Oh, this is horrifying, this story.
Okay.
This is a horrifying. This is where one of the pests are sparrows, and they kill literally billions of sparrows.
Yes. So So I thought this was also a moment when film and broadcasting was becoming popularized, and there was actually one newsreel. One of the propaganda films I looked at was made in southwest province of Sichuan, and it's called "Besieging Sparrows" or "How to Kill Sparrows." Because Mao had labeled sparrows together with mosquitoes and mice or rats together with as the four pests to be exterminated for, I guess, public hygiene purposes. And because sparrows were eating grain, and so they were destroying harvests supposedly, and so they had to be eliminated. And then from this province, one of the strategies they used to catch sparrows was to make a lot of noise. So in this newsreel, you see an entire county of people being mobilized to make noise, including women and children and elderly people. and they would just like bang pots and pans and using whatever objects at their disposal that can make the loudest noise so that the sparrows cannot rest. So they have to fly until they drop from the sky. And that's when people can basically pick them up off the ground and kill them. So in this 1958, there's an estimated something like 2 billion sparrows that it was.
You have, I think it might be a quote in the book where you sort of say the same children who are sort of running around making all this noise a year later will be dying from famine because of the locusts which come in that the sparrows aren't eating, essentially, and ravage the crops. So it's like
indeed, yeah. So that is there are many people who participated, also kind of also seeing the absurdity of it all, and yet they still had to participate.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. Recently, I asked Mint Mobile's legal team if big wireless companies are allowed to raise prices due to inflation. They said yes. And then when I asked if raising prices technically violates those onerous 2-year contracts, they said, "What the f*** are you talking about, you insane Hollywood ass?" So to recap, we're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
So there's, yeah.
That's a question I wanted to ask, because it is something that comes back, and I think it's a really interesting corrective here, that we often look at propaganda and we see society such as China through the socialist years as being monolithic, and everybody just sitting in a cinema, sitting in a village square or a field or wherever they might see these projectionists, and just reacting all in the same way. But of course, that's not true. They're very reactive. There's a multiplicity. And I was really interested in the audience reactions. Like, even at the beginning, there's this idea that they're to some degree kind of replacing local religions and almost becoming, there's a religiosity to them, even as they're trying to oust superstition. They're kind of finding superstition attached to them. So there's lots of sort of unintended consequences coming out of this.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So earlier we mentioned how villagers thought that there was almost some kind of a magic trick associated with cinema as a technology. And so some of the earlier propaganda films were in fact anti-superstition or anti-religion films, and saying that, shamanism doesn't work. And yet sometimes the villagers thought the projectionists themselves were the shamans, because they're conjuring up these images that can also disappear. Another aspect I really noticed when I was going to the countryside to look at the sites of projection, actually, like where I asked people where they watch films. And oftentimes they were watching films in spaces of worship in the villages. So, for example, like ancestral shrines, or where they do ancestral worship, are the biggest spaces they have in the village that could be enclosed, or those are the public village squares that often had ritual functions. And I also found out, like Buddhist temples and even Catholic churches being converted into auditoriums for film screenings in this period. So, and I had a sense that some of the, almost like the religious atmosphere, the religious aura of these spaces, in a sense, sort of rubbed off onto these films, so sometimes they would convert the shrine or its statues to local gods into a projection booth. And so the instead of praying to gods, and there would be in a way a new kind of altar, and what is being projected. Another very important kind of image that was projected was the images of Mao himself. And so I think that actually cinema had a big role to play in contributing to this cult of Mao. And the Mao cult itself, we talk about the personality cult from, the Cultural Revolution period when everybody was going to Beijing and Tiananmen Square to see Mao. But the film of Mao, or the newsreel of Mao meeting with, 1,000,000 Red Guards, was then shown 100 million people in the first month. So and then at every film screening, audiences were in a way asked to behave in the same way as the masses, the revolutionary masses in the film. So they're staging the almost like congregations of Mao worshippers everywhere. And again, the participants are very performative. If they shout, or even like actually when Mao died in 1976, I've heard some accounts from projectionists who were showing the funeral film, showing how it became kind of a ritualistic occasion to mourn together with the film. And many people had to cry, and there was a lot of anxiety about not being able to cry, because if you didn't cry, you might come across as being like a counter-revolutionary or something. Right. So even tears was not necessarily an expression of authentic emotions, but rather can be kind of performative crying at many films that's about the darkness of the pre-revolutionary past, or denouncing landlords, was almost necessary for someone to become an activist, to advance themselves later on. So they're quite interesting stories. And actually, maybe on the note of tears, I just mentioned one, my favorite anecdote about kind of resistance at the movies, but also compliance is so there are films that were made about Tibet, saying how before the People's Liberation Army came to Tibet, it was a terrible society, and there was serfdom everywhere, according to these films. And one particular film was about a poor boy who was so hungry. Like, the key scene is that he steals food from the altar from a monastery. And so, but people in Tibet who watched this film, many of them were still quite religious, and they thought it's a sacrilege to steal from the altar. And so they renamed this film, which was called Surf. They renamed it The Altar Thief. So they didn't really buy the message of the film. And yet, so according to Tibetan scholars who, they talk about their mother had to put tiger balm under their eyes to make them water, because they were still supposed to shed tears.
Right, to get the appropriate response. I remember exactly. There's a moment in your book where you talk about how, I don't think it's with a Mao speech, but it's with speeches by other sort of party dignitaries. If the audience feel they're going on too long, they'll start applauding before the speech is over. And it's kind of like, we're not going to boo because that would be too dangerous. So no one can nobody can stop us applauding. And that kind of resistance is interesting, but it's also interesting that as time goes on, the actual Mao himself actually starts looking at poisonous weeds, he calls them, the sort of the ideas that are coming up through film that aren't healthy, in air quotes, to the regime. And this is partly also mixed in with his wife's status as an actress, as a film actress.
Yeah, actually, Mao's wife, Tianqi, was a very interesting figure, and she had a huge role to play as initially in the 1930s, so before the communists came to power, before she met Mao, she was a film actress in Shanghai. And she was actually also a stage actress. She was very famous for playing Ibsen's Nora in A Doll's House.
Wow.
And after... Yeah, and so she was quite well known actually in the film world in Shanghai, and then later, after Mao had come to power and she was married to Mao, in the early 1960s, she became very active in the cultural realm, and she was really a cinephile. Mao, not so much actually. Mao did not watch that many films, but she watched many films, and then she would maybe tell Mao about it, and then he kind of reveal to him the what's wrong with them, what's not revolutionary about them. And so there was starting in the mid 50s or even early 50s, there was a film criticism was in a very effective way for top leaders to explain their ideas, because the films actually illustrated the wrong kinds of ideas. And so when films were considered ideologically problematic, or if films were like a bit too humanist and not advocating for like revolutionary militancy, then they might be denounced as so-called like poisonous weeds. So like if a film was denounced as a poisonous weed, then it couldn't, sometimes it was withdrawn from circulation. But what was quite interesting is that both Jiang Mao's wife, and Mao thought it would be a good idea actually to show these films that are denounced, so that censored films are not just taken away, but rather screened with criticism, so that like audiences can criticize them.
Yeah, this is fascinating. You mentioned there's one film where there's a death scene of someone, which is supposed to be, in the context of the film, is supposed to be tragic, but somebody sneers in the voiceover because it's like it's a royal person, so this person should die. This isn't that's crazy.
Yeah, so a lot of films were actually shown with a loudspeaker voiceover, like that was live broadcast in the movie theater. And my mother actually told me like she went to watch a film. It was a documentary film about the president of China, Liu Shaoqi, but who was denounced in the Cultural Revolution. So like an old newsreel about him going to Indonesia was screened again. And then the voiceover would denounce him and his wife as, so she remembered that voiceover. And then I've also found many scripts where people in the films would be denounced at the same time. And yet audiences, sometimes they really like these films that were denounced as poisonous weeds. So they went to watch them because they were actually very moved. And sometimes even were singing along. So there was a film that was associated with a general who was also denounced in the Cultural Revolution. So that film was being criticized, and yet audiences were singing along with a song that was sort of bidding farewell to him. And no one actually could tell who was leading the singing, so the audiences couldn't be arrested. These kinds of screenings of poisonous weed films mostly took place in urban areas. And so you have actually quite a sophisticated audience who they went to these films. Their job, maybe like the people who had the right to go to these films, had the job to write film criticism afterwards, denouncing the same films, but they also really enjoyed the films. So that's also the other part of the cinematic guerrillas, because they were kind of going undercover in some ways to these films and having very different reactions than what was the politically correct reactions.
Well, yeah, going back to what you were saying about camouflage, you can't quite tell who's on what side. Before we round up our conversation, I have to bring up one phrase which I loved. I absolutely adored this phrase, hot noise. When you were talking to some of the older women who still have memories, they would refer to the hot noise of the cinematic experience. Could you explain that a little bit for us?
Yeah, so I guess I was trying to, in many years of teaching cinema, I found myself using more like Euro-American Western film theories. And then so I was wondering, is there Chinese media theories too? And so from Mao and Jiang, I was asking these very fundamental questions about cinema. What is cinema to like national leaders, but also just to ordinary people, villagers that I talked to. And I said, what was cinema to you? What kind of films do you remember from your youth? When I interviewed them, and one common answer I got was it was 热闹 in Chinese, which translates directly into hot noise. And and what they mean by that is, first of all, that village life is very austere and there's not much happening. So whenever there's an event, like a celebration of any kind, a festival, then there is hot noise because there's a congregation of bodies and there's like warm human bodies together and they make a lot of noise together. So it's usually considered something quite positive because it's a celebratory event. But the other connotation when they said, "Oh, we're just watching hot noise," is that they actually don't remember the films themselves very well, and so it was just about coming together and gathering. So this really prompted me to write like a whole chapter just about like reception of cinema without thinking about what's actually shown in these films. But what do audiences actually see, hear, smell, taste, and touch in the environment of the screening space itself? Because for many people, they had to, for them, like it's like movie going. Sometimes the going is more memorable than the movie. They have to walk a really long time, maybe in the dark, and maybe they're like falling into a stream or something along the way, and it'll be very cold. And their shoes might freeze or something, and so these memories associated with movie going often went beyond the films themselves. And I was trying to kind of recover some of the sensory experiences, also the food that they consume. There might be lots of mosquitoes at these screenings, so people actually learned to smoke at the cinema because they needed to drive away mosquitoes. Or they might be listening.
I think I learned to smoke at the cinema, to tell you the truth. Just watching people on screen smoking, it was just like, I want to do that. That's
okay, yes.
But yeah, it's absolutely fascinating as an idea because I think that's so true. I mean, my visits to the cinema, I didn't have to go through streams or anything, but sort of you have to get the bus and there's Maltesers and there's, when I went in the 70s, there were these big plush, red curtained sort of theaters, basically. So I think that taking in that sort of smell and sound and atmosphere, that's a huge constituent part of the experience. So that's a fascinating way into the culture. Finally, I wanted to ask as well, like today, what is the legacy of the cinematic projectionists? How are they thought of today in China? Does this still happen? Is there a sort of, I think you refer to a sort of nostalgia. Occasionally there'll be something like it'll be reenacted. Or is it still active?
Yeah, so I was actually astonished to find that there were still a lot of open air, like mobile projectionists bringing cinema and setting them up in various like county squares, but also in urban areas, even near where my parents are living in Shanghai. They would near a shopping mall, there would be open air film projection, free films for the public. And this started actually in the 2000s, and the idea was to bring cinema back into the countryside. And there are many purposes associated with this, but in one thing I mentioned the religious, because of the locations for these screenings in the villages often also tend to be their like ancestral shrines in the Zhejiang area, for example. And I spoke to some of the people who were organizing the screenings, and they said, well, like if we didn't have films, then maybe people are going to go to church. And, then there would be so much influence by the Christians in our village. So we also want to organize some event for the elderly people who are, of course, the Chinese countryside today is a very different place because most of people, there's a lot of migrant workers going into the cities. So it's mostly older people and children who are left in the countryside. And so cinema still provides a form of entertainment and occasionally also propaganda. They also show slides in and also some local advertising for like local hospitals and so on. And so I've seen them. But another kind of legacy, because I didn't think this was a very sensitive topic. I started the project thinking it's going to be a nostalgic topic because people all remember fondly going to the movies in their childhood. But then many of the projectionists I talked to who, like former projectionists who are now much older and at their retirement age, they've been complaining about not having a pension. Not receiving a pension because that generation of projectionists recruited in the 1970s still belonged to they still retained their like peasant status. So they didn't become state employees, but they were actually working for many years as kind of propaganda workers, right? And so they felt that it's quite unfair that given the decline of cinema with the rise of television, and then they don't have this job anymore, that they are not paid a pension so they actually have been petitioning the government, and that's another kind of legacy that really made me think about who were the people so I asked these questions about who is cinema, and then the people that I talked to, I really remind me that people were involved in this whole infrastructure of screenings and propaganda. So so that's another major legacy, I guess.
Yeah, the infrastructure was flesh and blood. My first, I went to the Pingyao Film Festival, the first two editions.
Oh, wow, I have not.
Yeah, this is Tianqi's
yes.
film festival. There was the first edition was called Year Zero, I think, and then they had a sort of first edition afterwards, if you like. So I went to those first two, and he had this idea of basically rejuvenating this whole kind of a medieval town that has kind of been preserved. I mean, I'm not sure if I was told this correctly, but it was one of the very few towns which was sort of preserved from the war and the Cultural Revolution, that it wasn't sort of in some way knocked down. And so it's a very big sort of tourist center as well. But he had renovated a lot of the buildings in the industrial part of the town to make them into cinemas and to make them into exhibition centers, and it was very modern. But the screening of the evening films was always in this outdoor cinema, so it felt like exactly what you said. It felt like this hot noise. It felt like, or to be fair, cold noise, because it wasn't very hot when it was when it was run. So we all had to sort of wrap up in blankets and sit there. But it was an amazing experience, and especially because I remember we would go out to eat after the meals, and a bunch of critics, or I think it was about 15 international critics, very few. And we'd go out and we'd maybe stay up a little bit later than the town expected. And when we were coming home to our hotels, which were in the center of Pingyao, they turned out the lights of the whole town. Like all the street lights were out. It was absolutely pitch black. You know, you had to use your mobile phone to get through the streets. And it did make you think, wow, this has probably been like this for quite a few, hundreds of years. It's not, it was a very, very interesting experience.
Well, I'm so envious. I really have to go to this film festival sometime too. I haven't been, actually. I'm ashamed to admit.
Well, no, I mean, it was a great experience. I went to Macau the last year that ran, because that had I think 2 or 3 editions before it. It was basically COVID came in, and that was the end. It didn't survive COVID, essentially. I'm not sure if there's a chance that it might come again in a different format, but Macau was like almost the opposite of Pingyao in the sense of just geographically and culturally and every way. Yeah, and I got the opportunity to interview Jia Zhangke on a couple of occasions, actually. And he's an very interesting director, but also sort of entrepreneur now. He's it's interesting that he's made this move from kind of a dissident filmmaker in some ways to, with his very first films sort of not getting official releases and official certification to something of a national force.
Yeah. I think it's actually great when directors are also trying to enable other creators and to create like a better creative environment, I guess, where cinema can thrive more, and festivals and sometimes just creating occasions where films can be screened and where audiences can come together it's a tremendous thing for future creators too. So
all the screenings were full, and they would have like university students would come on coaches and go to see the movies, and so there was a real thriving sense that it seemed very exciting that as I say, I've not been for the last few years for obvious reasons with COVID, and then I think they started keeping it more of a domestic film festival rather than as fully international. So it'd be interesting to see how it plays out in the next few years.
Yeah, I guess there's actually a sort of a sequel. When I was researching this book, I really realized that what happened in the aftermath of the period that I was interested in is equally, if not even more fascinating, because in 1980s, when video came available, there were video halls, and there was a lot of film piracy as well. So in terms of film screenings and film exhibitions, even saying now, it sounds like even today's film scene is really worth researching.
Yeah, there you go. The sequel is coming. Cinematic Guerrillas 2, Electric Boogaloo. Excellent. So final question. I need a film book recommendation for our listeners, please.
Can I recommend my friend Ying Qian's book, also from Columbia University Press, called Revolutionary Becomings, and it's documentary media in 20th century China. It's really quite a groundbreaking book, because there's been quite a lot of interest in recent years in Chinese documentaries, but mostly independent documentaries made after in the 21st century, really. And but there's a much longer history of documentary filmmaking in China, and Ying really starts from the very beginning in the last years of the Qing dynasty, early 20th century. And then the book sort of covers a very long duration, and it talks really a lot about how it's more about the production of documentaries and how documentaries contributed to also nation building and revolutionary movements over the decades, actually over the course of the 20th century. And it's kind of a really magisterial book, so I highly recommend
Excellent.
Revolutionary Becomings.
Excellent. Wonderful. That sounds great. Sounds really fascinating. I mean, this whole topic is just so fascinating. It's such a world away from a lot of experiences that we've had in the West. But at the same time, there are certain points of connection which we can sort of hold on to and empathize with to a degree. There's plenty of propaganda in Western cinematic tradition as well. Just remind me, you're in London at the Barbican?
Yes, this is on November 28th.
November 28th. So if people want to go along to that will be... and the prize which you...
the Kraszna-Krausz Moving Image Award. The Kraszna-Krausz Foundation. Yeah, they also have a wonderful a photography award as well. So, but I'm
superb. Well, congratulations on winning that prize, and thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much. It was an honor and a pleasure to speak to you.
If there's one thing that my family and friends know me for, it's being an amazing gift giver. I owe it all to Celebrations Passport from 1-800-Flowers.com, my one-stop shopping site that has amazing gifts for every occasion. With Celebrations Passport, I get free shipping on thousands of amazing gifts. And the more gifts I give, the more perks and rewards I earn. To learn more and take your gift giving to the next level, visit 1-800-Flowers.com/ACAST. That's 1-800-Flowers.com/ACAST.
Cue the fireplace and your favorite fall movie. There's nothing better than a cozy evening at home with a glass of First Leaf wine. First Leaf is a personalized wine club that delivers right to your door. Sounds magical, right? They get to know your favorite tasting notes, which varietals you enjoy, and whether you prefer sweet or dry wines. So in every shipment, you get bottles tailored to your unique palate. Go to tryfirstleaf.com/fall to get your first 6 wines for just $44.95 with free shipping.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.